The Fall of France. How Hitler crushed Europe in 6 weeks. In the summer of 1938, Europe was living inside the illusion of peace. The First World War had ended only 20 years earlier, but its shadow still covered the continent. Every family seemed to carry a memory of loss. Every village had names carved into stone. Every government knew what another war might mean. Across Europe, leaders spoke of diplomacy, negotiation, and collective security. Newspapers wrote about treaties and conferences. Ordinary people wanted only one thing: to avoid another catastrophe. But in the heart of Europe, one man saw the world differently. Adolf Hitler, the German chancellor who had risen to power only 5 years earlier, was not trying to preserve peace. He was preparing to destroy the order created after 1918 and rebuild Europe according to his own violent vision. He had never truly hidden his intentions. Years earlier, in his book Mein Kampf, Hitler had written about revenge, expansion, racial struggle, and the need for Germany to acquire new territory in the East. His words were there for the world to read. But much of the world chose not to believe him. Many politicians thought he was only speaking to angry crowds. They believed that once he held real power, he would become more cautious. Others believed Germany had genuine grievances after the Treaty of Versailles, and that some revision of the peace settlement was reasonable. But Hitler was not merely revising borders. He was testing the will of Europe. In March 1936, he sent German troops into the Rhineland, a region that had been demilitarized after the First World War. Under the Treaty of Versailles and later agreements, Germany was forbidden from stationing troops there. It was a direct challenge to France and Britain. The German army at that moment was still weak. Hitler himself knew he was taking a tremendous risk. If France had marched, German troops had orders to retreat. But France did nothing. Britain did nothing. The League of Nations issued words, but words alone could not move armies. Hitler had gambled and won. The lesson he learned was simple and dangerous. The democracies were afraid. 2 years later, in March 1938, he moved again. This time, his target was Austria. Hitler had been born there, and many Austrians spoke German. Nazi propaganda claimed that Austria naturally belonged inside a greater German Reich. Under pressure from Berlin and facing internal Nazi agitation, the Austrian government collapsed. German troops crossed the border. They were not met by resistance, but by crowds, flags, flowers, and cheering. The Anschluss, the union of Austria with Germany, was complete. Once again, the response from Europe was weak. There were protests, there were speeches, there was concern, but there was no action. Then came Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia was a young state created after the First World War. It was democratic, industrialized, and militarily stronger than many people realized. It also contained a large German-speaking minority in a region known as the Sudetenland. Hitler seized on this fact. He claimed that the Sudeten Germans were being oppressed. He demanded that the territory be handed to Germany. The crisis grew through the summer of 1938 until Europe stood on the edge of war. In September, the leaders of Britain, France, Germany, and Italy met in Munich. Czechoslovakia itself was not allowed to decide its own fate. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain believed he could satisfy Hitler with a limited concession. French Prime Minister Edouard Daladier, whose country had a treaty with Czechoslovakia, did not want war without British support. So the Sudetenland was given to Germany. In return, Hitler promised that he had no more territorial demands in Europe. When Chamberlain returned to London, he waved the signed agreement before cheering crowds and declared that he had achieved peace for his time. Many believed him. They want to believe him. But Winston Churchill, then out of power but watching events closely, understood the meaning of Munich. He called it a total and unmitigated defeat. He warned that Britain and France had chosen dishonor to avoid war and would have war anyway. Hitler also understood Munich. To him, it proved again that Britain and France were weak. They would talk, they would plead, they would sacrifice allies, but they would not fight. Only 6 months later, in March 1939, German troops occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. This time, Hitler was no longer claiming to unite Germans. He was taking non-German territory by force and intimidation. The mask was gone. The policy of appeasement had failed. Europe had tried to avoid war by giving Hitler what he wanted, but each concession only made him stronger. Now the next target was clear: Poland. Poland and the road to war. Poland had regained its independence after the First World War, after more than a century of partition between empires. But its rebirth came with borders that angered Germany. The Polish corridor gave Poland access to the Baltic Sea, but it separated East Prussia from the rest of Germany. The free city of Danzig, with a largely German-speaking population, was placed under special international status. To German nationalists, this was a symbol of humiliation. Hitler demanded that Danzig return to Germany and that Germany be allowed a route through Polish territory to East Prussia. But Poland understood the danger. Czechoslovakia had given in and had been destroyed. Austria had been absorbed. The Rhineland had been remilitarized. Every concession had opened the door to the next demand. Poland refused. This time, Britain and France tried to draw a line. In March 1939, Britain gave a guarantee to Poland. If Polish independence was threatened by German aggression, Britain would come to its aid. France supported the guarantee. For the first time, Hitler faced the possibility that another move east might trigger a European war. But he did not believe Britain and France would truly fight. He thought their leaders were weak. He thought their people were terrified of war. He thought that if Germany moved quickly enough, Poland could be destroyed before the Western powers could act. Still, there was one danger: the Soviet Union. Hitler did not want a two-front war. Germany had lost the First World War partly because it had fought enemies in both East and West. If he invaded Poland and the Soviet Union opposed him, Germany might be trapped. At the same time, Britain and France were trying to negotiate with Stalin. A Western Soviet alliance might have surrounded Germany and perhaps prevented war. But the talks were slow and mistrustful. The British and French feared communism. Stalin distrusted the West. Poland did not want Soviet troops crossing its territory, fearing that once the Red Army entered, it might never leave. While the Western talks stalled, Hitler and Stalin moved quickly. On August 23, 1939, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact. The world was stunned. Nazism and communism were supposed to be mortal enemies. Hitler had built much of his ideology around hatred of Bolshevism. Stalin had presented the Soviet Union as the leading force against fascism. But dictators can set ideology aside when power is at stake. The public agreement promised that Germany and the Soviet Union would not attack each other. The secret protocol did something far more sinister. It divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Poland would be partitioned. The Baltic states would fall into the Soviet sphere. Hitler had secured his eastern flank. Stalin had bought time and territory. Poland was now trapped between two predators. On August 31st, Hitler gave the order for invasion. German troops waited along the border. The plan was ready. The world was about to enter war. At 4:45 in the morning on September 1st, 1939, German forces attacked Poland. The battleship Schleswig-Holstein opened fire on the Polish garrison at Westerplatte. German aircraft struck airfields, railways, roads, and cities. Tanks crossed the frontier. Infantry followed. From the north, German forces moved out of East Prussia. From the west, they pushed from Pomerania and Silesia. From the south, they attacked from Slovakia. Poland was struck from three directions. This was something new. Within days, German forces had broken through. By September 7th, German armored units reached the outskirts of Warsaw. The speed shocked Europe. Then, on September 17th, the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east. The secret pact had become reality. For Poland, the blow was devastating. The country was now fighting both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. There was no hope of organized victory. Warsaw resisted under terrible bombardment. German aircraft struck the city repeatedly. Civilians were killed. Buildings burned. Food and water became scarce. On September 27th, Warsaw surrendered. Some Polish units continued fighting into early October, but the campaign was over. Poland had been destroyed in less than a month. Germany and the Soviet Union divided the country. Both occupiers began brutal repression. Poland had become the first victim of the war, but it would not be the last. Britain and France declare war. On September 3rd, 1939, Britain and France declared war on Germany. They had honored their guarantee to Poland. But their declaration was not followed by immediate, decisive action. While Poland was being crushed, the Western Front remained mostly silent. This period would become known as the Phony War in Britain and the Drôle de Guerre, the Strange War, in France. It was war without major battle. Armies were mobilized. Posters went up. Blackout curtains were drawn. Children were evacuated from cities. Gas masks were distributed. But on the front, little happened. France had a large army. Millions of men were called up. Dozens of divisions stood along the German border. In theory, France had the chance to attack Germany while most of the German army was still committed in Poland. But the French command hesitated. General Maurice Gamelin, the French commander-in-chief, was cautious, elderly, and deeply shaped by the First World War. He did not want to risk a major offensive. France's strategy was defensive. It relied on time, blockade, and the belief that Germany could be worn down. The French launched a small advance into the Saar region, but it was limited and timid. French troops moved only a short distance into German territory and then stopped. After Poland fell, the French quietly withdrew. The opportunity was gone. France settled behind the Maginot Line. The Maginot Line was one of the greatest defensive systems ever built. It stretched along the French-German border with forts, underground barracks, artillery positions, tunnels, railways, ammunition stores, and armored turrets. It represented French fear and French memory. The trenches of the First World War had taught France that defense could save lives. The Maginot Line was designed to prevent another German invasion across the same frontier. But the line had one critical weakness. It did not fully cover the border with Belgium. Belgium had declared neutrality and refused to allow French defenses on its soil. So the strongest fortifications stopped before the most obvious route around them. French planners knew Germany might attack through Belgium, as it had in 1914. Their plan was to move the best French and British forces north into Belgium as soon as Germany attacked. It seemed logical, but it was exactly what the Germans would exploit. Through the winter of 1939 and early 1940, the two sides waited. On one side, French and British soldiers settled into routine. On the other, German commanders prepared for the next campaign. Hitler wanted to attack in the west quickly after Poland, but bad weather, logistical concerns, and doubts among his generals delayed the offensive again and again. The original German plan was not especially imaginative. It resembled a modified version of the 1914 Schlieffen Plan: attack through Belgium and the Netherlands, pull the Allied armies north, and drive toward France. But then a new idea emerged. General Erich von Manstein proposed a daring alternative. The main armored thrust should not go through the obvious northern route. It should pass through the Ardennes. The Ardennes was a forested, hilly region considered difficult for tanks. Allied commanders believed a major armored attack through it would be unlikely, perhaps impossible. Manstein believed that was precisely why it could work. The Germans would attack Belgium and the Netherlands to draw the Allied armies north. Then the main panzer force would break through the Ardennes, cross the Meuse River near Sedan, and race west to the English Channel. If successful, it would cut off the Allied armies in Belgium and northern France. It was a massive gamble, but Hitler liked gambles. The plan was adopted. France did not yet know it, but its fate had already been placed in motion. May 10th, 1940, the store breaks. At dawn on May 10th, 1940, the phony war ended. German forces launched their offensive in the west. The attack struck the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France in a single vast operation. The German army moved with speed and coordination that stunned its enemies. In the Netherlands, the Germans used airborne forces on a large scale. Paratroopers and glider troops landed behind Dutch lines, seizing bridges, airfields, and key positions. The psychological impact was enormous. For the first time, defenders saw enemy soldiers falling from the sky in organized formations. The front was no longer only in front of them. It was behind them, around them everywhere. In Belgium, German glider troops attacked the fortress of Ebene-Mail. This fortress was considered almost impregnable. It guarded important bridges over the Albert Canal and was built with thick concrete, heavy guns, and strong defenses. But the Germans had trained carefully for a surprise assault. Small teams landed silently on the roof of the fortress in gliders. They used shaped charges to destroy gun emplacements and observation points. Within hours, the fortress was effectively neutralized. Belgian defenders resisted, but the shock had done its work. The road into Belgium began to open. For the Allied command, the German attack seemed to confirm expectations. Germany was repeating 1914. The main blow appeared to be coming through Belgium. General Gamelin ordered the Dill Plan into action. The best Allied forces, including the British Expeditionary Force and elite French armies, moved north into Belgium to meet the Germans. They marched toward the trap. While Allied attention focused on Belgium and the Netherlands, the real German attack moved through the Ardennes. Long columns of tanks, trucks, fuel vehicles, artillery, engineers, and motorcycles pushed through narrow forest roads. The traffic jams were enormous. At times, the German columns were vulnerable. A strong Allied air attack might have caused chaos. But Allied reconnaissance and command response failed to grasp the danger in time. The German spearheads kept moving. On May 12th, they reached the Meuse River near Sedan. This was the critical moment. If the French could hold the river, a German plan would fail. If the Germans crossed quickly, the entire Allied position in the north could be cut off. The French units defending Sedan were not the best in the army. Many were reservists. Their morale was uncertain. Their anti-aircraft defenses were inadequate. Their communications were fragile. Still, they had a river line and defensive positions. Then the Luftwaffe arrived. On May 13th, German aircraft unleashed a massive bombardment against French positions. Stuka dive bombers screamed down from the sky, their sirens howling. Explosions tore through bunkers, trenches, artillery positions, roads, and command posts. The physical damage was serious. The psychological damage was worse. Some French units broke under the pressure. Communications failed. Rumors spread that the Germans had crossed in huge numbers. Commanders lost control. Heinz Guderian, one of Germany's leading armored commanders, saw his chance. German assault troops crossed the Meuse. Engineers built bridges. Tanks began moving to the western bank. The breakthrough had begun. Guderian did not want to wait for infantry. He did not want to pause. His entire doctrine was speed. Keep moving. Exploit confusion. Do not allow the enemy to recover. By May 15th, the German front at Sedan had burst open. French attempts to counterattack were too small, too slow, and too poorly coordinated. Colonel Charles de Gaulle, commanding the French 4th Armored Division, launched one of the few effective counterattacks. He understood the importance of tanks and mobile warfare better than many senior French officers. His attack briefly slowed the Germans. But without adequate air support or broader coordination, it could not stop the tide. The German armored columns continued west. On May 20th, German units reached the English Channel near Abbeville. They had cut France in two. The Allied armies in Belgium and northern France were trapped. The scale of the disaster was now clear. More than 1 million Allied troops were in danger of being encircled. The best French armies, the British Expeditionary Force, Belgian troops, all were being squeezed into a shrinking pocket. French command tried to organize counterattacks, but confusion, exhaustion, and mistrust made cooperation difficult. The British commander, Lord Gort, concluded that saving the British army had become the priority. He began pulling his forces toward the Channel coast. The destination was Dunkirk. Dunkirk, the narrow escape. By late May 1940, hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers were trapped around Dunkirk. Behind them was the sea. Before them were the advancing Germans. The situation seemed hopeless. If the British Expeditionary Force were destroyed or captured, Britain would lose the core of its army. It might no longer be able to defend itself. It might be forced to consider peace. Then, on May 24th, Hitler issued one of the most debated orders of the war. He told the Panzer forces to halt. German tanks stopped short of Dunkirk. Historians have debated this decision for decades. Some argue Hitler wanted to preserve his armored forces for the final campaign against the rest of France. Others suggest Hermann Göring convinced him that the Luftwaffe could destroy the trapped Allies from the air. Others point to difficult terrain, supply concerns, and caution among German commanders. Whatever the reason, the halt gave the Allies time. In Britain, Winston Churchill had become Prime Minister on the very day the German offensive began, May 10th. Now, only weeks later, he faced disaster. He authorized Operation Dynamo, the evacuation of Allied troops from Dunkirk. The British Admiralty gathered every available vessel: destroyers, minesweepers, ferries, fishing boats, Plagerkraft, lifeboats, yachts. Small civilian boats crossed the channel to help bring soldiers home. The beaches of Dunkirk became scenes of chaos and endurance. Soldiers stood in long lines stretching into the water, waiting for rescue. Bombs fell around them. Ships burned offshore. Smoke covered the sky. Oil spread across the sea. The Luftwaffe attacked repeatedly, but the Royal Air Force fought above the beaches. Spitfires and Hurricanes engaged German bombers and fighters, often out of sight of the soldiers below. Many men on the beaches believed the RAF had abandoned them because they could not see the air battles taking place farther inland or above the clouds. They had not been abandoned. At the perimeter, French troops fought fiercely to hold back the Germans. Their sacrifice was essential. Without them, the evacuation might have failed. From May 26th to June 4th, approximately 338,000 Allied soldiers were evacuated from Dunkirk. More than 200,000 were British. More than 100,000 were French. It was far more than expected. Churchill had feared that only a fraction could be saved. But the evacuation came at a cost. Thousands were killed. Many ships were sunk. The British Army left behind almost all its heavy equipment: tanks, trucks, artillery, ammunition, and supplies. The army escaped, but it returned home nearly disarmed. Churchill warned Parliament that wars are not won by evacuations. Dunkirk was not victory, but it was survival. And survival mattered. Britain still had an army. Britain was still in the war. For Hitler, the campaign in northern France was a triumph, but Dunkirk was also a missed opportunity. The British army had escaped destruction. That army, rebuilt and rearmed, would one day return to Europe. The collapse of France. After Dunkirk, the military position of France was desperate. The best Allied forces had been destroyed, trapped, evacuated, or exhausted. The French army still had units in the field, but its structure was badly weakened. General Maxime Weygand, who had replaced Gamelin, tried to organize a new defensive line along the Somme and Aisne rivers. It became known as the Weygand Line. But the troops were tired. Many units had been shattered. The Germans had momentum, air superiority, and confidence. On June 5th, Germany launched the second phase of the campaign, Operation Red. The attack smashed into the remaining French defenses. German infantry and armor pushed south. Rommel's 7th Panzer Division advanced with extraordinary speed, earning the nickname Ghost Division, because even German headquarters sometimes did not know exactly where it was. The French fought in many places with determination. The idea that France simply refused to fight is false. Many French soldiers resisted bravely, but the strategic situation was collapsing. German armored units broke through. Refugees clogged the roads. Command systems failed. The government fled Paris. Millions of civilians joined what became known as the Exodus. It was one of the largest movements of people in modern European history. Families abandoned homes. They carried mattresses, bags, food, and children. Cars ran out of fuel. Carts broke. Bicycles collapsed. People walked under the summer sun, not knowing where they were going. German aircraft sometimes attacked refugee columns, spreading panic and death. The roads south became rivers of fear. On June 10th, Italy declared war on France. Mussolini had watched Hitler's victories and won a share of the spoils. President Franklin Roosevelt called it a stab in the back. The Italian offensive in the Alps achieved little, but the symbolism was bitter. France was already bleeding, and Italy had chosen the moment of collapse to strike. On June 14th, German troops entered Paris. The French government had declared the capital an open city to avoid destruction. Most Parisians had already fled. The streets were strangely quiet as German soldiers marched past monuments that had once symbolized French power and culture. The swastika flew over the Eiffel Tower. For Hitler, it was a moment of personal triumph. He visited Paris early in the morning on June 23rd. He saw the opera, the Arc de Triomphe, the Eiffel Tower. He posed for photographs. He stayed only a few hours, but the message was clear. France had fallen. Germany had avenged 1918. In the French government, the debate was bitter. Prime Minister Paul Reynaud wanted to continue the struggle from North Africa. Charles de Gaulle, recently appointed to a government position, supported continued resistance. France still had an empire. It still had a navy. It could keep fighting. But others disagreed. Marshal Philippe Pétain, the aged hero of Verdun, believed France had lost. General Vagon also demanded an armistice. They argued that continuing the war would only bring more suffering. On June 16th, Reynaud resigned. Pétain became prime minister. His first act was to request terms from Germany. In a radio address, Pétain told the French people that the fighting must stop. For millions, it was a moment of shock and grief. The man who had symbolized French endurance in 1916 now became the voice of surrender. Hitler chose the location for the armistice carefully. The forest of Compiègne, the same railway carriage in which Germany had signed the 1918 armistice. In 1918, Germany had been humiliated there. Now Hitler would reverse the scene. The French delegation arrived without being told exactly where they were going. When they saw the railway carriage, they understood. The humiliation was deliberate. Hitler entered with his senior officials and generals. He listened as the German terms were read. Then he left without speaking. The insult was complete. France would be divided. The north and west would be occupied by Germany. The south would be governed by a French administration based in Vichy, but under German pressure. France would pay the costs of occupation. Its army would be reduced. Its prisoners would remain in German hands. And most shamefully, the French authorities would be required to hand over certain refugees, including Germans who had fled Nazism. For many anti-Nazis and Jews who had escaped to France, this was a death sentence. On June 22, 1940, France signed the armistice. On June 25th, it came into effect. The campaign was over. France had fallen in 6 weeks. De Gaulle and the refusal to surrender. But France did not entirely surrender. On June 17th, Charles de Gaulle left France for Britain. The next day, June 18th, he spoke over the BBC from London. His words were heard by relatively few people at the time, but they would become legendary. France has lost a battle, he said, but France has not lost the war. This was a world war. France could continue from abroad, from its empire with its allies. He called on French soldiers, engineers, workers, and officers to join him. The Vichy government condemned him. It saw him as a rebel, a traitor, but de Gaulle was planting the seed of free France. At first, his movement was small, weak, uncertain, but over time it would grow. Resistance networks would form inside occupied France. French colonies would choose sides. French forces would fight in Africa, the Middle East, Italy, and eventually in the liberation of France itself. The fall of France was one of the most shocking events of the Second World War. In 1918, France had stood among the victors. In 1940, it was defeated in 6 weeks. The consequences were enormous. Britain now stood alone in Western Europe. Germany controlled the Atlantic coast from Norway to the Pyrenees. The Luftwaffe could prepare for an assault on Britain. The balance of power had shifted dramatically. Many across the world believed Hitler was unstoppable. But his victory contained hidden dangers. Britain had not made peace. The British Army had escaped at Dunkirk. The Royal Navy remained powerful. The RAF was intact. The United States was watching. The Soviet Union was still outside the war. And Hitler, intoxicated by success, began to believe that boldness would always bring victory. That belief would carry him to even greater risks. First against Britain, then against the Soviet Union, and finally toward the destruction of his own regime. France had been defeated. Paris was occupied. Europe was under Nazi domination. But the war was not over. In many ways, it was only beginning. Conclusion. The fall of France was not simply the result of German strength. It was also the result of years of hesitation, miscalculation, fear, and outdated thinking. Europe had watched Hitler break treaty after treaty. The Rhineland, Austria, the Sudetenland, Czechoslovakia. Each time, the democracies hoped that the next concession would be the last. But dictators who are rewarded for aggression do not become satisfied. They become bolder. When war finally came, France and Britain had declared it, but had not acted quickly enough to save Poland. Then, during the phony war, they waited. They trusted defenses. They trusted plans. They trusted assumptions. The Germans, meanwhile, gambled on speed, surprise, and concentration. In May 1940, the old world met the new one. The old world had concrete forts, slow decisions, and memories of trench warfare. The new war had tanks, radios, aircraft, and commanders willing to move faster than their enemies could think. That difference destroyed France, but did not destroy hope. At Dunkirk, an army escaped. In London, Churchill refused peace. In exile, de Gaulle refused surrender. Inside occupied France, men and women would eventually risk everything to resist. The defeat of 1940 was a disaster, but it was not the end of the story. The same beaches that saw retreat in 1940 would one day see return. The same France that fell in 6 weeks would one day rise again. And the same Hitler who stood victorious in Paris would, 5 years later, die in a bunker beneath the ruins of Berlin. History often turns on moments of fear, on choices made too late, on warnings ignored, on the belief that danger can be managed if only one more compromise is made. France fell because Germany attacked with speed and ruthlessness. But France also fell because Europe had spent years refusing to face what Hitler was. By the time the truth became undeniable, the storm had already broken. And in the spring of 1940, that storm swept across Western Europe with terrifying force.